I should like to ask you, Dr. Blix, in a moment if you have further reflections on lessons out of the Iraq experience in your inspections, but just to touch on one point, you said much earlier this afternoon, talking about a telephone conversation you had with former Prime Minister Blair, where you said, "At that time I still thought there were prohibited items in Iraq." Was that because of the material balance analysis derived from the UNSCOM era essentially?
Well, anthrax played a big role to me all the way through. Of course, we could not exclude. Sometimes we get too much credit and say, "You were right. You said there were no weapons of mass destruction." We did not say so. We said, "We have not found any." After 700 inspections and going to sites given to us, we did not find any, which is not the same thing. We did not exclude, but we didn't. I mean, Mr. Blair said that we didn't find the truth, but we found the untruth of some of the allegations, and that was important enough. We would have uncovered some of the truth, but not the whole truth. As I said, it was not necessary. You could have ended this affair without the whole truth. You asked me for a reflection. I think I have spent much time on my reflections. I gave one a moment ago. That was the value of the inspections. Now here is a multilateral system set up by governments and enabling inspectors to go onto the sites. It is a very valuable institution. It must be independent. It must not be prolonged dams of intelligence. This is one experience that is useful for the future. The other reflection I have is a broader one about the going to war. I am delighted that I think your intention is to draw lessons from the Iraq War rather than anything else, and I think that when can states go to war still remains a vitally important issue. The UN Charter in 1945 took a giant leap forward in this and said, no, it is prohibited to do except in the case of self-defense and armed attack or authorization by the Security Council. Well, here in the case of Iraq you can see how the UK in the summer 2002 or the spring 2002 said, yes, we might, but it has to be through the UN power. Self-defense against an armed attack was out. Regime change was out. Straw was adamantly opposed to a regime change. Authorization by the UN, yes, that's the path. So they insist upon 1441 and they get it, but it is a gamble. 1441 is if they had shown or if the Iraqis had continued to obstruct, as it was expected, then they could have asked the Security Council for a second resolution and said, look, they are obstructing and we now ask for authorization. They never knew whether they would get that. Eventually they had to come with, I think, very constrained legal explanations. We see how Mr. Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith now, wriggled about and how he himself very much doubted that it was adequate, but eventually said, well, if you accumulate all these things, then that gives a plausible. He was not quite sure that it would have stood up in an international tribunal. Most of your legal advisors did not think so either. Nevertheless, he gave the green light to it. I think it shows the UK was wedded to the UN rules and tried to go by them, eventually failed and was a prisoner on the American train, but it is true at the same time that this rule against going to war is under strain. When you have missiles and you have discussions about preemptive action, it is under strain. If you see a missile coming, that's one thing. But if you simply suspect that a missile site is activated, do you then have an all-out war against them? This is a difficult. We have had also a practice in the UN, as I touched on earlier, in which you have some trespassing of this rule, some erosion of it in Tanzania or in Kosovo or in Sierra Leone.
Could I just intervene a moment on Sierra Leone? Is this in the same category? Our understanding had been this was a legitimate sovereign government inviting help rather than an intrusion.
Yes. No, I am not critical of Sierra Leone. I myself am critical of Kosovo. I am more skeptical about that. Still, to me the Security Council is there, and even if you go back to Blair's speech in Chicago, he talked about the duty to protect. That was something novel in the interpretation of the UN Charter. He outlines a number of things that would be necessary to go to war. It should be doable and should be the right case and so forth. I don't think he mentioned the approval of the Security Council, but I think that's actually what came out, that, yes, you must have in all these cases also the approval of the Security Council and authorization. People say, what is the Security Council? The Russians and Chinese will obstruct. Not after 1990 necessarily. They are there. If they had not been willing to go along with the use of force against Iraq and they were not willing to go along with it in the case of Iraq, I think that was probably their wisdom, and therefore it is legitimate to look at it. If we discover a terrorist movement, someone preparing, I would not be surprised if the Russians and Chinese would go along with some preemptive action. In the case of Iraq, some people maintain the war was legal. I am of the firm view that it was an illegal war. I think the vast majority of international lawyers feel that way. This can be discussed, but I don't think. There can be cases where it is doubtful, where maybe it was permissible to go to war. Iraq, in my view, was not one of those.